Welcome back to Required Reading, where this week we're continuing our read of the novelization of the movie Gremlins, written by George Gipe. This week it's chapter 15. Billy roared up to the school, amazed at how few students he had passed on the way, but relieved that he would not have to deal with the traffic bottleneck at the entrance circle. Pulling as close to the front entrance as possible, he got out of the car and trotted to the door. It was locked. Inside, past the cross-hatching of wired glass, he could see that the main hallway was in almost total darkness. The Christmas exodus seemed to be more complete this year than ever. There was a solitary figure in the hallway, however, so Billy pounded on the door with one hand and rapped his key against the glass with the other. Reluctantly, the figure, who turned out to be veteran maintenance man Waldo Sodlaw, ambled up to the door and yelled the obvious thing. "Closed," he said. "It's an emergency," Billy replied. "Please let me in, Mr. Sodlaw." Perhaps knowing the old gentleman's name helped. In any event, he grimaced one time, sighed, and finally opened the door. "Thanks," Billy said. "What's the emergency?" "I've got to see Mr. Hanson." "He's gone." "Are you sure? Did you see him leave?" "No, but I made it pass through his class. He wasn't there. Left the lights on in his lab, so I turned them off." "Well, I'd better check," Billy said, starting to move down the hall. Sodlaw followed. "I told you," he said. "He's gone. Now let me close up and get my work done so I can go home." "I'll only be a minute," Billy yelled over his shoulder, breaking into a trot. He left Sodlaw far behind, but could hear his footsteps echoing through the deserted halls when he turned into Hanson's lab and stopped. The lights were off, shades drawn, and no one seemed to be about. But Billy felt a presence. For one thing, the room had a strange smell, completely unlike any of the dissecting smells he remembered from his days in biology lab. When he heard a sharp intake of air, he jumped, looked around, but could see no one. He stood, listening. Behind him, far down the hallway, Mr. Sodlaw was carrying on a semi-hysterical conversation with someone else outside the building. Something about a book left behind. Billy tried to separate those voices from a new sound closer to him, much closer, which reminded him of a young girl trying to suppress a giggle. But where was it coming from? Billy had taken a step toward the light switch when he saw something that sent a chill up his spine. A shoe, with the foot inside it turned at an odd, uncomfortable angle, as if, walking slowly towards it, he saw the rest of the body lying behind the lab table. The twisted form of Roy Hanson. "Mr. Hanson!" Billy cried out. A wave of panic threatened to make him run from the lab, but he resisted. If the man was only injured or even in critical condition, Billy could do much more good by staying than rushing out. Breathing a silent prayer that Hanson was still conscious, he forced himself to move towards him. One quick glance at the body told him that Hanson was indeed dead. The same glance indicated that the death was not of natural causes. With mounting horror, Billy gasped at the sight before him. 36 hypodermic needles had been inserted into various parts of Mr. Hanson's torso, making the unfortunate man into a grisly pincushion. In addition, there was a major gash, as if he had been knifed or clawed. A high-pitched scream reverberated through the lab. It was not uttered by Billy. Hearing the first echoes of it, he whirled to look into the shrieking jaws of what seemed to be something out of the dinosaur age. High in the air at Billy's eye level, the dark green armor-plated thing had hurled itself towards the young man from its hiding spot on the top of a nearby cabinet. The combination scream-giggle ended just as the gremlin struck Billy's chest. knocking him backwards and sideways. Tripping over Hanson's body, Billy cringed away from the massive claws as they passed less than an inch from his face. In an instant he regained his feet, but so had the green demon, which immediately hopped onto the lab table and started another bombing attack. Billy ducked, causing the gremlin to clatter noisily against the wooden cabinets near the floor. It quickly regained its feet, sprung forward, and with one huge claw gouged a section of corduroy and flesh from Billy's leg. The epithet died, aborting as a second lunge by the gremlin brought the two together in a clinch, one of the creature's claws bearing down heavily on Billy's eyes. Turning quickly away, he lashed out with his forearm, striking the gremlin across the side of its face. It seemed more surprised than hurt by the blow, but Billy was able to slide out of its hot, greasy embrace. "Mr. Sadler!" he yelled. Simultaneously, he made a break for the door. Though smaller, the gremlin made up the distance between them quickly, hurling itself against the wall in a kind of carom shot that closed the door and brought it face to face with its adversary. Billy looked around. There was no other way out. His wound, which he had been able to ignore during the heat of battle, now began to throb with pain as he faced the leering creature, blocking his way out of the lab. Then, with frightening speed, the gremlin launched itself once again, a savage missile speeding directly towards Billy's chest. In all his centuries of life, Gizmo had never been in such a perilous situation. He was actually in the clawed fist of a gremlin, vulnerable to mutilation or death by a variety of means. How had it happened? And why? Only a few days before, he had been happily snoozing away his peaceful life in the old Chinese man's shop. And now this! Like mortal beings on every galaxy, he suddenly felt terribly unprepared as the moment of his death approached. The cackling face before him, identified by the coarse white fur, could belong only to Stripe, he thought. "So, Minority Mogwai," its different but still recognizable voice grated. "We meet again." Gizmo nodded sadly. "Almost ready now," Stripe laughed. Gizmo looked around the room at the remains of the 4 pods and the 3 new inhabitants, who waited impatiently for Stripe to complete his business. Only slightly smaller than he, none of them had the distinctive striped mane, but Gizmo was certain they were every bit as evil. "Let's get going," one of them said. "There's no action here. It's boring." "We'll go," Stripe yelled back. "How about a game of Gizmo Ball first, though?" With that, he flipped Gizmo towards one of the others, giving his body a heavy spin, so that objects whirled by crazily during the brief but frightening trip. The second gremlin hurled him all the way across the room in much the same manner, but the third gremlin conveniently allowed Gizmo to bounce off his claw tips before landing on the floor. The unfortunate Mogwai could not help crying out as his side, cut and bleeding, he landed with a thump on his back. Stripe went into a fit of hysterical laughter. "Pick him up!" he yelled. "Throw him again!" His partner obeyed. 5 or 6 more times Gizmo made the horrifying, increasingly nauseating flight from one set of clumsy claws to the next. Then, caught by Stripe, he suddenly felt himself held aloft and turned head down so that he was looking directly into the fierce red eyes. "One more throw," Stripe giggled. "The next time I get you back, I'm going to rip you to pieces." Going into a grand wind-up, he finally released Gizmo, sending him spinning towards the gremlin awaiting him across the room. Billy's mind must have decided that death being so close at hand, It would slow down the final moments of his existence so that he might savor the very act of breathing. In any event, as the gremlin flew toward him, Billy suddenly felt as if everything was moving in slow motion. Scant microseconds passed, but during that interval he scanned every section of the lab within his field of vision. Into the cabinets filled with beakers and Bunsen burners, but no weapons. The counters with their microscopes and slide dishes, but no weapons. To the walls with framed pictures and a fire extinguisher. A sudden rush of hope caused his body to perform a marvelously reflexive movement, as if he had had his legs shot from under him. Billy dropped downward like a rock, causing the gremlin to fly over him, its claws flailing frantically in an effort to catch a piece of anything. Even before the falling motion was completed, Billy seemed to twist in midair, his body arching sideways and upward towards the hanging extinguisher. Like a third baseman knocked to the dirt by a hard drive to the chest, he was on his feet in one motion and at the wall. Tearing the extinguisher loose, he got it in front of him just as the gremlin sprang again. As it became a blur rushing towards him, he managed to hit the on switch. The velocity of the gremlin's flight caused it to become an instant casualty. Shrieking wildly, its head flew into the funnel of the extinguisher with such force it tore the instrument from Billy's hands. As both the extinguisher and gremlin struck the wall opposite, a terrible clatter was heard, followed by the rushing noise of the foam and the scream of the creature, which was unable to remove itself from the red tube, thrashing wildly about the floor as it was force-fed the noxious foam. It kicked, jerked, and clawed great slices out of the wall before it died. Billy lay on the floor, still stunned until he heard nothing but Mr. Sodlaw's continuing conversation far down the hallway. Getting slowly and painfully to his feet, he looked about him, just to make sure it wasn't all a dream. But Roy Hansen was still there, and so was the extinguished gremlin. Any exhilaration he might have felt at being spared had a very brief existence. "Mom!" he called out, suddenly remembering that there might be 4 more of the same type of monsters at home. Rushing into Hansen's classroom, he picked up the phone and dialed his home number. He was relieved when his mother answered after only 2 rings. "You okay?" he asked. "I think so," Lynn replied. "I couldn't get out of listening to Miss Heine, who just finished psychoanalyzing me. Is everything all right at home?" "Yes, to my knowledge." "Listen," Billy continued. "Get out of the house." "Why?" "Those mogwai turn into terrible things, killers." "Really?" "Mr. Hansen's dead," Billy interrupted. "The biology teacher who was studying one of them. It killed him, Mom. I saw it, and then it attacked me." "Are you all right?" "Yes, I'm cut up a little. Can you make it to Dr. Molinaro?" "Forget me, Mom," he said impatiently. "I'm telling you to leave the house and take Gizmo." "But we've nowhere to go, and maybe those things won't—" "Mom, I'm telling you." "Just a minute," she interrupted. "I think I heard something, a noise, like a thump." "Leave! Just leave!" "I will. First, I'll check upstairs one more time, and then I'll grab Gizmo and go, okay?" "Yeah, hurry. I'll stay on the line. Give me a shout just as you go out the door, so it'll ease my mind." "All right," she said, placing the receiver on the counter and starting out of the kitchen. The flight that was scheduled to be Gizmo's next to last turned out to be his last, thanks to an errant throw by the over-enthusiastic Stripe. Careening wildly towards the gremlin across the room, Gizmo realized, even in his disoriented situation, that he was not going to hit the intended target. Raising higher and higher, he passed above the gleaming claws and headed for Billy's trophy shelf. As the object raced closer to him, Gizmo tried to curl into a ball to protect himself. Fortunately, he hit the set of yearbooks first. Comparatively soft objects spun down the length of the shelf in a whirlwind of papers and metal trophies, and finally dropped off the end, next to Billy's laundry chute. For a split second, Gizmo looked dumbly at the square opening before suddenly realizing that, wherever it led, it was his highway to freedom. Hurling himself upright as the gremlins approached, their fangs bared and claws glistening, he hit the wooden door like a fullback, sacrificing his body to get the first down. A moment later, his ears ringing and head throbbing from the impact, he plunged downward into the black void that smelled vaguely like his friend Billy. "Hurry up! Hurry up!" Billy nearly shouted into the receiver. It had been at least 3 minutes since his mother had promised him she would grab Gizmo and return with a final word before leaving the house. What could have taken so long? Was she in trouble? Was Gizmo in some godforsaken hiding place? He looked anxiously at his watch, weighing the benefits of staying on the line, which was basically for his own peace of mind, versus hanging up and getting home as soon as possible. "I'll give her 30 more seconds," he murmured, watching the digital numbers flash by. As so often happens when an ultimatum is delivered to either a person, a nation, or fate itself, the response was less than the deliverer hoped. In this case, nothing. "All right, then," Billy said decisively. "That's it. I can't wait any longer." Hanging up the receiver, he took off towards the front door, his mind filled with conflicting emotions. His sense of responsibility told him he ought to find Mr. Sodlaw so that the body of Roy Hansen would be taken care of. Another voice warned him that the scene back in the lab, coupled with his running out of the building, could get the police after him in a hurry. But he was too anxious about the safety of his mother and Gizmo to do the right but very time-consuming things. Ignoring Mr. Sodlaw, who appeared out of a side corridor a moment later and began shouting questions after him, Billy slammed against the front door with his shoulder, spun around from the force of the impact, and raced towards the car. 10 feet from the vehicle, in trying to save a few seconds, he reached in his coat pocket for his keys, and in separating the VW key from the others, took his eyes off the snow-covered ground ahead. A moment later, having missed the curb, he was lying face down in a snowdrift. The key was somewhere else. Lynn was barely out of the kitchen when she heard the series of bumps and scrapes that told her where to investigate. The first sound came from above and proceeded vertically downward into the basement after a brief pause at the first floor level. She recalled that the laundry chute had a wooden lip there on which clothes occasionally got hung up. She had asked Rand to repair it many times, but as he always managed to have an excuse, Lynn had been dealing with the situation by keeping a long pole in the basement next to the washer-dryer and chute. Playing the sounds through her mind, she had no doubt at all that a small animal had fallen, or been thrown, down the chute, managed to cling briefly at the lip, and then continued into the basement. Because of the midpoint delay, it was very likely the animal, whatever it was still alive and well. Before descending into the basement, she paused. "If," she said, "maybe I'd better, just in case." Going to the kitchen cabinet, she got out the large sushi knife Ren had bought just after he discovered this oriental delicacy, and become interested in developing a machine that would replace those talented people who put the dishes together right before your eyes. Moving down the steps cautiously, she went to the laundry chute and gently opened the door. Holding the knife in front of her, she looked inside. A pair of glazed eyes stared back at her, swathed in a jumble of undershirts and socks. The object blinked once, but made no other movement. Was it Gizmo? One of the others? Lynn couldn't tell. The dim lighting and chaotic layer of dirty clothing prevented her from making a visual identification, and she was not about to reach in and touch the creature. While she hesitated, a series of other sounds from the first floor quickly convinced her that what was happening immediately above her was more pressing than getting this animal, whatever it was, out of the laundry chute. As a matter of fact, she thought, with a flash of decisiveness, it might not be a bad idea to keep this baby prisoner for the time being. Reaching into Rand's tool chest, she grabbed the hammer and a 3-penny nail. A few seconds later, the chute was nailed firmly shut. Picking up her knife once again, she started quickly up the basement stairs, slowing down only when she reached the top step. Opening the door, she looked into the kitchen and took a step into the room. A moment later, one of her antique china dinner plates shattered against the wall behind and above her, sharp pieces and powder raining onto her head and down the back of her dress. Lynn screamed. The sound was soon mixed with a high-pitched hysterical giggle. Regaining his feet, but not his composure, Billy looked about for his lost keys. Had they disappeared in the snowdrift along with him? Or been thrown clear? He stood perfectly still so as not to disturb the snow or possibly bury the keys beneath his weight. Searching with his eyes from a squatting distance, he saw nothing. Meanwhile, Mr. Sodlaw was rapidly approaching, muttering in inaudible imprecations. "Hey, boy!" he shouted when he was a dozen feet away. "You're supposed to check with me before you leave. How do I know you ain't got a microscope or something else stuck in your coat?" "Hold it," Billy said evenly, and then shouted back when Sodlaw continued charging forward. "Hold it, I said!" Shocked into immobility, Sodlaw glared at the upstart, his wide mouth moving nervously as if working up to a good string of threats and rejoinders. "I dropped my keys in the snow," Billy explained. "Please don't mess up anything." Sodlaw stood his ground while Billy looked, but he continued talking. "Oh, listen," he said. "I let you in when I wasn't supposed to. And then you run out on me. If something's gone, I could lose my job." "Nothing's gone, Mr. Sodlaw," Billy replied. "How do I know that? What were you doing in there?" Billy spotted a gleam of something shiny in the snowdrift. Reaching down, he pulled out his keys. "I gotta go now," he said. "Do you want to pat me down? It's okay, but be quick." He unbuttoned his coat and held his arms out straight, the better to facilitate Sodlaw's frisking him. The old man took a step forward, then shrugged. "Never mind," he muttered. "I guess you're all right. You ran out so quick, like something awful happened, or you stole something." Billy was already in his car and grinding the engine to life. For a second he considered telling Sodlaw what had happened before speeding off. He rejected the notion. "Merry Christmas," he said instead, roaring off as quickly as his fishtailing rear-engine car would allow. After Lynn finished dodging the first barrage of expensive dishes, she had a brief respite in which to look at her attackers. One stood near the china cabinet in the dining room, giggling and searching about for new objects to throw. It eventually decided on a heavy punch bowl, tipping it off the shelf and roaring gleefully when it broke neatly in two. The second gremlin was busily going through Lynn's pots and pans, tossing them underhanded and backwards as it dug through the drawers. A third was in the pantry, systematically emptying the contents of every box and jar onto the floor. It took only a moment for Lynn to assimilate everything she needed to know about them. That they were powerful, ugly, destructive, and, most important, dangerous. Common sense indicated that she should run screaming from the house and summon help. Overriding that was a fierce anger that they were vandalizing her kitchen. An equally fierce determination to defend this precious, hard-won home prevented her from doing what both was safe and wise. "Get out of my house!" she yelled. She did not expect them either to understand or obey the order. What she was doing was serving notice, giving them one last opportunity to cease their depredations before she attacked them. It was, in effect, a declaration of war. A chorus of glee mixed with shattering dishes and crumpled boxes was their answer. "All right," Lynn muttered, grasping the knife tighter and moving into the middle of the room. It was not a good move, and that she was vulnerable from bombardment from 3 sides instead of just one. Objects flew at her head, a plastic coffee mug striking her temple along with a cloud of pancake flour. Angered to the point of blind fury, Lynn lashed out at the gremlin closest to her, which stood on the counter she had used only a few hours ago to make cookies. The blow struck home. The sushi knife, diamond-sharp blade gouged a sizable portion from the gremlin's thigh. It roared furiously at Lynn, found another knife in the cabinet just above its head, and prepared to throw it. Lynn let fly the coffee cup, causing the gremlin to recoil and stumble backwards. In doing so, it caught its clawed fist in the top of Rand's patented orange juice maker. Seeing that the animal was momentarily hung up in the machine, Lynn lurched forward and flipped the start switch. With a loud whir, the device started, its powerful engine drawing the arm of the gremlin in even farther. With a scream of agony, it began to spin round and round, the arm disappearing up to the shoulder as a stream of greenish mush spewed out of the juice spout. Fascinated and horrified, Lynn watched as the entire gremlin was sucked into the machine and regurgitated as pulp. A barrage of bottles and cardboard startled her from her temporary paralysis. Timing their throws craftily so that a steady stream of debris fell on her, the 2 gremlins left in the kitchen renewed their attack with even greater fury. Now they concentrated on heavy and sharp objects, a paring knife striking Lynn's cheek and drawing blood. Terrified and furious, she lunged towards the closest gremlin, but in doing so slipped on the glop covering the kitchen floor. Lying helplessly, she saw both of them crouch prior to leaping. Billy had gone through several traffic lights, but at Granger Street, a moving van backed out directly in front of him, causing him to jam on the brakes. The sudden action caused the car to do what he prayed it wouldn't: stall. Billy yelled, took a deep breath, and turned the ignition key. For a minute the grinding sounds, which gradually became weaker, told him the familiar story he had been plagued with for so long. The carburetor was flooded. Getting out, he shoved the VW as far off the road as he could, and started running. "Merry Christmas!" a few passersby shouted at him. Even as she reached for the aerosol can of Raid lying inches from her face, Lynn wondered how long her luck was going to hold. A moment later, she squirmed sideways to avoid one of the leaping gremlins, and let the other one, still airborne, have a hefty squirt of the vile-smelling chemical directly in the eyes. Temporarily blinded and infuriated, it crashed into the first gremlin, and, slashing wildly with its claws, tore several big chunks of flesh from its brother's body. Forgotten in the confusion, Lynn scrambled to her feet, still holding the aerosol can. Backing towards the counter, she suddenly became aware of another presence in the kitchen. Whirling, she saw a third green monster, poised to strike. Because it was standing on the counter, its horrible red eyes were on the same level as hers, a pair of mesmerizingly penetrating orbs that seemed to generate their own evil light from within rather than reflect outside illumination. Aiming the insect spray at it, she succeeded in forcing it back into the corner just in front of the microwave oven. Then, with a quick, almost spasmodic leap, she managed to push the gremlin backwards through the open door and into the oven. Closing the door quickly, she set the temperature to maximum, turned the oven on, and leaned against the door so the thrashing beast could not get out. With the other hand, she held the aerosol can in front of her, to ward off the angrily circling gremlins planning their next attack. A minute later, as she heard popping, disintegrating sounds from the oven, an errant thought crossed Lynn's mind. "Thank God I listened to Rand for once," she thought, "because he talked me into getting the oven with the big door." Looking back and down through the glass into the oven, she could see that the gremlin had been baked into a huge, ooey green omelet, the evil red eyes now decorating the bottom portion of the lump like twin spurts of ketchup. No sense worrying about that one, she thought, making a sudden rush for the kitchen door and living room. Her quick lunge carried her past the gremlins, but they caught her near the Christmas tree, one tripping her low while the other landed on her back. Lynn screamed as the animal's knife-like claws tore into her shoulder. Struggling wildly but futilely, she knew it would be impossible for her to handle the two of them. All she could do was make it as difficult for them as possible. With that desperate strategy in mind, with one gremlin clinging to her leg and another to her back, she closed her eyes and hurled herself into the twinkling Christmas tree. As he broke from a fast trot into a desperate sprint, Billy wondered if anyone on earth had ever been forced to see what he had just seen. Approaching his own home, he was impressed with how cheerful and peaceful it looked. The warm lights of the interior offering pleasant contrast to the snow-covered landscape outside. The centerpiece of the idyllic home scene was the large Christmas tree, aglow with twinkling lights, an ever-changing symbol of the holiday spirit, an emblem of peace and contentment. Then, just as the image had finished registering on Billy's mind, the tree fell completely out of sight. "Holy!" he gasped as he began to sprint. "Please, don't let me be too late!" Running on the snow-covered street with its alternating layers of ice, soft snow, and car-created ruts was not easy. Several times he fell, scraping his hands as he threw them forward to protect himself. But he never took his eyes from the picture window of the house. The silhouette he wanted to see, that of his mother, refused to appear and bring him a quick answer to the question that haunted him. Stumbling up the front steps, Billy slammed into the house. Reaching out automatically to grasp the wall sword he knew would be heading towards the floor momentarily. It did, almost provincially settling into the hand awaiting it just as Billy saw that Lynn was still alive but bleeding, her neck protected from the claws of one gremlin by a tangle of Christmas tree limbs and ornaments. Leaping forward, Billy swung the sword, missed, and swung again. One of the gremlins, the one with the mane of white fur, ducked the blows, but the second took the full force of Billy's swing just above the shoulder. The edge of the sword dug into the armor plating, then gathered momentum as it reached the soft subcutaneous tissue, neatly severing the body from the gremlin's head, which rolled into the fireplace. Its expression, caught in a terrified leer, slowly melted to a grotesque frown as the head burned to a crisp. As Lynn struggled to get to her feet, she and Billy heard a giggle from across the room. It was Stripe, his eyes aflame with anger and defiance. For a moment Billy seemed about to go after him. Then he turned his attention to his mother. "Are you all right?" he asked, putting the sword down so he could assist her. "I think so," Lynn murmured. Ever practical, she added, "I think that's the last one. Maybe you'd better get it." Billy picked up the heavy weapon and started after Stripe, but the gremlin, now having realized that he was at a disadvantage, looked for a way to escape. Leaping onto a windowsill, he managed to avoid Billy's first swing, which embedded the sword in the molding. By the time Billy wrestled it free, Stripe had rolled himself into a ball and hurled himself at the window. Shattering the glass, he landed in the snow and scurried off into the night. "Oh, no!" Billy muttered. He and Lynn took a moment to examine each other's wounds, which were colorfully bloody, but not severe. "Where's Gizmo?" Billy asked. "In the basement. I think he must have jumped down the laundry chute when this all started." Good. Lynn smiled, brushed a sweaty lock of her hair from her forehead. I nailed the door shut, she said. That was before I knew who was who. Picking his way through the kitchen debris, Billy paused a moment to look at the two gremlins, one baked and the other blended, which his mother had dispatched. Boy, he said, shaking his head, you really are a tiger, aren't you? Well, let's put it this way, Lynn replied. I'm not one to be leaned on. Descending into the basement, Billy found a claw hammer and pulled out the nail to the door of the clothes chute. He opened the door, looked inside. Gizmo, he said. You in there, pal? A rustle of material was followed by the gradual emergence of the two long triangular ears and a soft furry head of Gizmo. Blinking nervously at the light, he soon broke into his familiar falsetto hum. When Billy reached out, he moved quickly into his hands to be lifted from the jumble of clothing. Hey, are you all right? Billy asked. Putting Gizmo on the top of the washer-dryer, he examined him for broken bones, noting where he had been cut in several places. Let's go put some tape on those cuts, he said, carrying Gizmo upstairs. Lynn, beginning to straighten up the kitchen, stopped to pet Gizmo and compliment him on still being among the living. I thought they killed you, she said. Hey, Mom, look, Billy said suddenly. Gizmo's eyes were wide as he stared at the remains of the two gremlins in the kitchen. His expression seemed pleased but somewhat restless, his head swiveling nervously from side to side and off toward the living room. Len looked at Billy blankly. Don't you get it? Billy said. He's wondering what happened to the other guys. He knows that there are 2 down and wants to know about numbers 3 and 4. Taking Gizmo into the living room, he showed him the gremlin's head in the fireplace and the ghastly-looking body on the hearth. Gizmo grinned and then frowned. Yeah, Billy said. You're right. One got away. Gizmo started to make anguished noises. What's the matter? Len asked. We have to get the last one, Mom, Billy replied. It's no good unless they're all caught or destroyed. Well, there's time enough for that, she said. We can call Sheriff Riley and let him track it down. You don't understand. We don't have much time. If the last one reproduces, it'll start all over again. You've got some bad cuts, Lynn protested. I'd rather you go see Dr. Molinaro. Mine aren't as bad as yours. All right, we'll both go. Tomorrow. After they become infected, you mean? Billy knew his mother was being logical, but he also felt that logic dictated a prompt hunt for Stripe. Although he usually obeyed his mother for the simple reason that she was often right, Billy shook his head. I'm going now, he said, while his tracks are still fresh, and before he has a chance to multiply. All right, then. He located Gizmo's knapsack and put him inside. Hurrying upstairs, he pulled on a sweater for extra warmth. He ran back down the hallway, and he shrugged into his coat. He felt a cold metal object in his pocket. Lynn watched as he pulled it out. It was a can of Raid. It's my secret weapon, she said. You may be able to use it. And don't forget your sword. Grabbing a flashlight and strapping Gizmo and the knapsack onto his shoulder, he kissed his mother and went out into the snowy night.